Welcome to Generation Change, a global series that attempts to understand and challenge the ideas that are mobilizing youth around the world. I'm Luna Safwan, an independent journalist based in Lebanon, where Gen Z campaigners are fighting for radical change. The challenges they face couldn't be more daunting: economic collapse, political stalemate, social unrest, and the devastation caused by the August 2020 explosion here in Beirut. In this episode, we meet two young people using their skills to combat decades of corruption and sectarianism. They believe a total reset is the only way forward. Karim, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood in Beirut? Were there any specific moments or events that shaped your political activism?
The early part of my childhood was, not really influenced by politics, but as I grew older, gradually I became interested in Lebanese dynamics. However, also imported lots of the ideas and concepts that were created by the Lebanese ruling class in terms of the sectarian connotations of the crisis. So at the end of the day, we're all partly products of the society and the general ideologies instilled by the regime. But then I got exposed to various other ideas, movements, groups that try to deliver an alternative vision for what the country may be, as opposed to what I learned it to be as a child.
Why do you think that the secular club is important? And will it have some kind of effect outside the scope of Lebanese universities?
The secular club, it started as a socio-cultural political space for students to know more about politics and the various developments happening. It looked at students as a social group, and this group had to have economic interests which had to be protected, whether it's leading on judicial battles against the administration to protect student freedom, or leading on tuition strikes, which protected students' rights. In 2019, it was basically the youth student component of the October 17 uprising, but it also transformed into a force which is able to impose a certain discourse on the Lebanese landscape.
Are you optimistic that MADA network will emerge as a political movement in Lebanon?
Now, the way I see it, the MADA network is already a political movement. The network has an expansive social base and then has taken the grassroots as a strategy. It has taken the idea that it should be creating a counter-hegemony and challenge both sectarian parties, militias, banks, and the various other forces which have co-opted these spaces. And that's our way forward. And I think that's what makes it a political movement.
Azza, you were part of the generation that was born in peacetime. But in 2006, this changed for you.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I was in Lebanon during the 2006 war, during the summer. I was impacted physically, but also I took it in and I understood, even when I was 12, that narratives impact public opinion. But it was really during the 2014 Gaza war, when I was interning at a major news organization, that I understood the weight and the importance of accountability journalism and independent journalism. So that was the road that I took in my career.
Lebanon witnessed a series of protests in the past years, from 2011, 2015, and then the big 2019 protests. What was the role of the media?
In Lebanon, the media are owned by partisan groups and political parties, which are the political class that a lot of people and the protest movement rose up against. At the heart of corruption are enablers, which are the mainstream media. Disinformation is the illustration of corruption in narrative and ideas. So it's really important for me to focus on the media narrative and also counter it through investigative work. So with the independent media organization I worked for, I took on the daily news, reporting and covering the violations against protesters, the protests that were happening all over the country. There were media blackouts. So we were the ones who shed light on what was going on in a way that most media, mainstream media, didn't.
There has been an increase in attacks on journalists and on media workers. Is freedom of speech in danger in Lebanon, in your opinion?
I think freedom of speech right now is going through a specific kind of challenge because of social media and the government's use of social media to intimidate people into self-censorship. We need to speak against that, whether or not the intimidation is there. And I think a lot of independent media workers understand this risk, and they understand that now is the time to continue with the accountability journalism, continue with open source investigations in order to uncover the status quo and to dismantle it completely.
Karim, Azza, thank you so much for being with us here today. Your generation did not really witness the civil war in Lebanon. However, everyone has been scarred in the country, maybe through our parents or through stories that we hear. Now, I want to start with you, Karim. How did this shape your political activism in the country?
Now, although we didn't experience the civil war, we were taught or inherited a narrative about, sectarian connotations, even forms of heroism, people that we were supposed to think of very highly. At the end of the day, we also formulated a counter-narrative, the idea that we are transcending the civil war and transcending the sectarian connotations which exist alongside of it. And this is something we're currently working on.
What about you, Azza?
So I also have a kind of unique upbringing, as my parents are both from secular backgrounds. So I had this angle that I got from my parents, while understanding the trauma that they lived through during the Civil War, since it's an inherited intergenerational trauma, and wanting never to have this happen again. So this was basically my viewpoint going into politics, going into activism, and going into journalism as well.
So is your generation more radical, Karim, more uncompromising in a way?
We were taught for a long while in Lebanon that this is the country. These are the relationships that exist between the ruling class and the people, between the people themselves, between the various political factions which exist in the country. And we're suggesting that there's nothing static about Lebanon. Lebanon is always in a dynamic transformation. And we're here, experiencing another dynamic transformation, which came about after October 17, which came about after the August 4 explosion. We do think that we have the agency to create a viable alternative.
Azza, what are the ways in which you can implement such change, in your opinion?
I think that we learned a lot from what's happening around us since the so-called Arab Spring, and what people our age as well were able to achieve, not only in 2011, but also in 2019 with us across Iraq, Algeria, Sudan, and elsewhere. And we learned from each other about tactics and futures and histories that we want to work together towards.
Karim, you're the chair of the political working group of the MADA network, which connects secular clubs across universities in Lebanon. Can MADA transform the student activism into a nationwide political movement, in your opinion?
Well, I think this is already the case, in the sense that the network is established in more than 12 to 13 universities. This suggests that there is potential for genuine competition between secular progressive components in Lebanese society against more sectarian, reactionary components which have existed historically. The secular clubs or the MADA network are not only calling for secularism, they're also calling for a wider progressive package that also deals with social justice, more democratic inclusion, ideas pertaining to being completely liberated from norms which have destroyed our society. So we're not an distant ideological group. We are part of the society who are speaking to them with their basic needs.
How can you actually convince people who might be even older than this generation to vote outside the scope of their sects when you have 18 sects in Lebanon, when you have political parties that are based on their sects and that are not based on merit or even deep politics?
The problem with tackling such a question is that we need to tackle its root, which is clientelism. When someone votes for a political sect, they're also voting for the ability to get a job, to be able to get in a school, to be able to get social welfare, and all of these things that are tied to sectarian political parties. So really thinking about getting people to vote outside of their sectarian loyalties, we need to also be cognizant that we are telling them to make themselves vulnerable to a reality without the social protections and the political protections that a mainstream political party would offer them. So this opposition movement should have certain alternatives and realistic solutions to the sectarian clientelistic system that has been ingrained in every institution, in every part and parcel of our life.
So what you're saying basically is that non-sectarian opposition groups need to compete with these long-lasting political parties by proving that this is not the way.
So actually, and this was a very interesting phenomenon that happened after the August 4 Beirut blast. People came together from across Lebanon and formed networks of solidarity and financial collaborative solidarity networks that don't mimic the same authoritarian clientelistic structures that we're so used to.
Karim, the government would say that they are attempting to tackle corruption in Lebanon with establishing an anti-corruption committee and a new law tackling corruption in the country. What's your opinion on that?
In Lebanon particularly, the term corruption is basically and potentially a meme, particularly when it's anti-corruption. Because the issue in Lebanon was not just corruption in the sense that, we have some interest being distributed within state sectors. It's a very structured and systemic issue we have, and has been amplified since the 90s. We have a rent-based economy that's completely based on monopolies, the banking sector plus the real estate sector. We have a sectarian system which completely distributes all ministries, all spoils that have come across after the war. We have enlarged debt. We have a lot of social and economic inequality. No productive sectors which produce anything, and we're simply living the remnants of an extremely neoliberal and unfair economy. So people that are saying we want to fix corruption, but don't even want to fight back at the interests of the oligarchy and the banks, then we can't really trust whether they're actually fighting corruption. So as long as this is at stake, there's no such thing as anti-corruption.
Azza, on August 4th, 2020, tons of ammonium nitrate exploded in Beirut, causing damage to the whole city. Can you tell me what happened on that day?
So I was in the office. I had a work call in the middle of it, and then 6:08 happened, and then I felt a tremor that took me back and forth. And I hadn't realized what had happened, but I heard the noise of a huge explosion, and I saw that everything was destroyed around us. Our colleagues were really close to the windows. And we were trying to figure out if anyone was injured. And because my apartment and my office were right beside each other, and I could see complete destruction of my apartment. Because this was an office for an independent media organization, some of our videographers took their gear and they went down to film the carnage. It was a complete massacre. It was something that I think no one wants to live through again or ever.
What about you, Karim?
Once I heard the explosion and I felt that everything was shaking, the first thought that came to my mind is that this is it. I also was quite frightened in the position I was in because I felt maybe the building could collapse at any moment. So it was extreme uncertainty about the next 30 minutes. After I was out and took my car, I noticed that people are injured everywhere. So it was a huge, catastrophic moment in which everything normal in our lives was halted.
Azza, you mentioned that you were in an office working with an independent media organization. Did you manage after that to resume your work directly?
I think what fueled us to continue and to actually double down on our reporting and on our coverage was our anger towards whatever happened and whoever were responsible. So this could be seen with our investigations, with our daily news coverage, and trying to piece together what happened. Why was there a fire? What blew up before the ammonium nitrate? Where was it exactly and which warehouse? I was able to look at, okay, this video was taken on the roof of this building at this time. This enabled me to actually piece together something so that I can know what happened, because the anxiety of not knowing was worse than the anxiety of what happened after.
$15 billion is the number estimated when we talk about the damages that were caused by this explosion. There are so many alleged accusations that corruption reached aid. Where does corruption end, Karim?
Aid is definitely not the answer to corruption, because feeding this regime with more funds, particularly by the international community, will only lead to its reproduction and its safeguarding its own bases. The solution is in us, is in the hundreds of thousands of people from various social groups and backgrounds and sects who believe if they mobilize and create different systems of solidarity, this could potentially create an adequate resistance to the regime. But there is no certainty in sight, but there is always hope.
Karim, can I just jump in here? When I look at or I understand corruption, it isn't just from an institutional governmental perspective, but if there's corruption one place, it's probably tied to corruption elsewhere. When Megaphone News did an investigation about the origins of the ship that brought the ammonium nitrates to the Beirut port, they were tied to Syrian, Russian firms with addresses in London. So corruption is global. And I think when we want to understand and to fight corruption, we need to think about it as a system of solidarity that is borderless at the same time, and collaborate with independent media organizations, just like the Panama Papers have done, to uncover money laundering scandals across the world.
I think there's something really important in what she said, but there's also something to emphasize on based on this. The Lebanese regime is tied to international and global interests which sustain it. Now that is something to critique, but it's also something to look at and slightly so be inspired from. That if we do break these links, or if we do create alternative links across borders, that could multiply the strength of our movement, and potentially we could benefit from an alternative international network of people who think this way. And that's how we can create an alternative power in the country and ultimately replace the current regime in sight.
I mean, Karim, just looking at the protest tactics from the October 2019 protest movement, we learned from Hong Kong, we learned from Turkey, we learned from Sudan, and then again in May 2020, when the George Floyd protests started, Lebanese activists helped or created a guide for Black Lives Matter activists in Minnesota in order to help them in terms of digital security, help with tear gas. So this solidarity doesn't just transcend our fight against corruption, but also our fight against authoritarian regimes and oppressors.
One of the so many challenges that the country is facing is immigration or brain drain. Many of the young generation are leaving for good. Karim, you mentioned that you're part of the MADA network, which is connecting different secular clubs, but the protests are kind of on hold right now. How do you motivate people? How do you revive these events in the streets?
Not many people have the luxury to go out. A lot of people are stuck here in this sense, and they have no choice but to fight back. 4 days after the August 4 explosion, when the people basically occupied Martyr Square, they weren't saying, let's make some calculations and see if we can afford this or that. They just went. Sometimes we assume that if people emigrate, then they don't have a role. But this is a huge fallacy at times. The Lebanese regime benefits from the diaspora. They benefit from the fact that we're gonna export everyone and then they'll give us the money so we can sustain ourselves. The opposition has a reality. The reality is that people are outside. How can they benefit us? Well, most of our organizational mechanisms are becoming online as grassroots movements, so people can take part in meetings, in sharing ideas, in talking to people, in getting people to vote. So that's all about creating alternative network by using the diaspora that was exported by the regime itself.
But also, Karim, I think as opposition groups or as students or union organizers, we need to learn to radicalize our hope for the future, which we saw on the streets in the beginning of the 17 October 2019 protest movement. People were coming together, dancing, cooking together, singing together, trading things with each other. These are informal systems of relationships and trade that had never been seen in at least downtown Beirut until before the civil war.
Azza, we do know how media is monopolized in Lebanon, how it's tied to private businesses, to politicians. How can you change that?
So first, I think we need to recognize that 12 political families own at least half of the mainstream media in Lebanon. The other half is either owned by businessmen, by individuals politically affiliated, or by specific political parties. So the control over, one, the media, but two, and most importantly, the discourse and the sources of information is squarely in the hands of those in power. But independent media organizations have found ways, mobilizing the diaspora and becoming important sources of information from the ground, since they are the only ones that film from the ground, from the point of view of the protester, from the point of view of the oppressed. But again, the independent media needs to work together with grassroots movements, with civil society organizations, to bridge together all these things in order to have a sustainable future.
When you talk about all of these hopes and dreams, there's a certain component that we need to talk about, and that is challenging a secular state. Hezbollah is a dominant political Shiite party in Lebanon. Now, some argue that they are a state within a state. How do you build a secular government with the presence of such parties?
And I don't think it's even possible to look for genuine radical reform in the country with a state within a state like Hezbollah, which is not just a party that distributes, it's an infrastructure of a state in of itself. It participates in other conflicts in the region, and it also tokenizes on various causes. Now, the question remains, how do we resist this? And I do also have an issue with those who proclaimed to fight against Hezbollah, when in fact, they only tackled Hezbollah from their own sectarian point of view. It was never a progressive starting point, and that's something that's extremely necessary if you want to go a step forward.
But isn't it challenging because Hezbollah says that they are present to defend the Lebanese borders?
The only way to tackle such a permeated deep state as Hezbollah is to recreate a new narrative. It does not mean we have to concede to Hezbollah at all. In fact, that's a big mistake many opposition parties are doing. We need to continue creating this counter-hegemony from a starting point which is secular, progressive, and in solidarity with all of those oppressed by Hezbollah and by not Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So.
Is there space for optimism in a country so complex like Lebanon that awaits for the 2022 elections or some kind of change?
There's never pessimism or optimism. There is a complex reality, as you said. And this complexity in of itself gives us hope. Because what's happening this year may not happen 3 years later. But the 2022 elections cannot be seen as a breakthrough. It can only be seen as a tool. However, many other breakthroughs await, because at the end of the day, Saad al-Hariri in October 29, 2019, was not taken out in elections. He was taken out by the street. And the street could reinvent itself, as does the Lebanese regime.
So I agree completely with Karim in saying that elections is a tool. It's not a means to an end. I think organizing through syndicates, through clubs, through student unions, and across identities and sectarian loyalties is really important.
So are you going to be the generation that finds a solution for this ongoing crisis in Lebanon?
I don't know.
That's a lot of responsibility for a generation, because I think our parents thought they would be that generation, and I think their parents thought they would be that generation. So maybe, yeah.
Listen, I actually think there's no such thing as this, one-time change in the country. Lebanon 200 years ago was different than Lebanon today, and social movements always existed and pressured in a certain direction. So I think each generation made its contribution, and we're here to make our modest contribution and to see what comes ahead of us.
That's it for this episode of Generation Change from Lebanon. Karim, Azza, thank you so much for taking part. It's been a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luna.